Welcome back to Crisis Communication. This is a lecture for the first chapter of the Crisis Communication textbook and a beginning introduction to what we are studying. Now, I'm not going to be spending time trying to cover everything in each chapter. I expect you to read them and be familiar with the content. The slide decks I'll be attaching week to week will give you some additional summary of the material in each chapter, and I'll highlight the things that I really care about and some of the things I think are critical for you to know. But when it comes down to taking your exams and when it comes down to using course material for your research paper, you're responsible for all of it. And so please take the time to read everything, to review the lecture notes, and hopefully to listen to these briefer podcasts. I'm only going to keep these to about 10 minutes to 15 at most. I'll try not to be too wordy. And as a result, you'll get a kind of thumbnail sketch of everything. But your goal is to be able to put all this together on your own. Read it carefully, look at the examples, questions, respond to discussions, and try and put each of these individual areas together. Hopefully at this point you've had a chance to look at the syllabus and enter onto the online learning site. You need to send me the email address used to set up your Facebook account so I can log you in and set you up on our Facebook discussion site. If you haven't done that by now, please do so. Take a look at the assignments. Online classes have the advantage of some flexibility. You're not attending class, but at the same time, sometimes you don't have the urgency that other classes have of being there and having things done at a particular time. We have deadlines for this class, and it will be difficult for you to just make up time if you let things slide. The individual chapters on a weekly basis are not that long, and some of the additional readings I will assign you are not exceptionally lengthy either. So please pace yourself. Take some time, put aside some time, a few hours each week, to review all these materials, ask me questions, answer the discussion sections. Try to get engaged enough so that everything comes together and you're not trying to overdo it at the very end. You can't, it won't work that way. And so please start working now and kind of develop a good pace of attachment to the course materials. Chapter 1, like so many introductory chapters of textbooks and classes, is an introduction. And it is important to think about what are the important components of what we are studying. Every crisis textbook that I've used or looked at always define a crisis somewhat differently. They always have their own kind of take on them. But there are some common variables and some things we use in part to identify what is and is not something that qualifies as a crisis. Even if an event or an activity may not strictly fit these definitions, however, that doesn't mean they are not a crisis for someone. It also doesn't mean that some of the lessons that you were learning in this class could not be adapted for or applied to those situations. But for the sake of clarity and for the sake of focus in this class, your authors have attempted to explain what some of the common variables are that a crisis represents, so you understand what some of the expectations are that you would face in answering to a crisis as a leader or communicator. Common characteristics of crises include the fact that it's a surprise. It doesn't mean they haven't thought about it before, or even that they haven't had some degree of preparation, but it's a surprise enough in the sense that we certainly didn't know it was going to come today, that we are taken off guard, and that we are going to be forced to sort of change our routine because of this event. All crises represent threats, various kinds of threats. It could be a reputational threat on the credibility of the organization or its leadership. It could be a threat to life or property. It could be all of these things. But crises represent some danger to an organization or an individual or a community that are forcing them to respond, and oftentimes very quickly. Which comes to our third component, a short response time. Social media has now made it possible for very rapid information about a crisis to be expressed, for people to hear about things within moments, and to be commenting on them and looking for a response. we don't always have the luxury of knowing everything before we commit ourselves to answering questions to the press or to a community about a crisis. And this is posing more and more and deeper challenges. But in today's world, when something happens, people want answers. They want them now. And so one of our challenges is to meet some of those expectations as best we can without being misleading or being dishonest or inaccurate. So if you look at the textbook definition of a crisis, your authors define a crisis as an organizational crisis is a specific, unexpected, and non-routine event or series of events that create high levels of uncertainty and simultaneously present an organization with both opportunities for and threats to its higher priority goals. So look at this definition. First of all, many and most work on crisis communication has focused on organizational related crises. Other people or groups or entities also experience a crisis. Celebrities, leaders, other sorts of institutions. But for the most part, much of our literature in crisis comes out of organizational communication literature. That means, however, that you may need to adapt some of their assumptions to the actual individual or stakeholders that are facing a particular crisis. It is specific. It's not just some random feeling of a crisis. There's something has happened. It's unexpected. Again, it's a surprise. And it's non-routine in the sense that you can't respond to a crisis in the same way you would respond to any other event. It requires a different set of tactics or responses or answers. It can also be a series of events, not just one event. It could occur over time. It could occur in stages. Or it could occur almost simultaneously. When Japan had its earthquake and the tsunami and then a near meltdown of its nuclear power plant, all these things piled on top of each other. So sometimes a crisis is a combination of things. For example, on the West Coast, they had wildfires, and they are now also having landslides because the soil has been damaged. So crises can occur in multitudes or layers or clusters, and sometimes we have to deal with that. They create high levels of uncertainty. What that means is that populations, publics, employees, leaders don't know exactly what to do. There are a lot of questions. What is next? Will we have a job? Will the company survive? So this uncertainty is one of the reasons why communication becomes so critical, because people have questions, they are uncomfortable, and they need answers. Simultaneously present an organization with both opportunities and threats for its goals. Our authors in particular use an approach to crisis communication you'll learn about called a discourse of renewal. They see in every crisis not only a danger or threat, but an opportunity, a chance for renewal, a chance to change the organization, to improve it, to expand it, to make it more safe. And so we want to keep that in mind when we look at the crises we study. What are the threats? That's all the negative stuff, and that can be kind of depressing. But what are the positives that have evolved out of a crisis, and what can leaders do to make a crisis meaningful? And if you can do that, you're going to survive a crisis more effectively. So this textbook definition helps give you a few, at least, directions to go in thinking about what qualifies as a crisis and how you might answer that crisis. So just because we have a challenge or a problem or an emergency, that does not mean it's a crisis. People tend to use the language of crisis for everything, and especially the media. Just because popular media has said we have a crisis, that doesn't mean it fits our sense of one or our expectations of an appropriate response. On page 7 of your textbook, there's a nice little chart there that will help you to think about your definition. So one of the things you're going to be asked for later is to create your own research paper and choose a crisis. Next week, you'll be asked to talk about crises you've experienced. Try to use these definitions to explain when and how something is or is not a crisis. Now, the literature in crisis communication can be used for other emergencies and threats, but we still, again, want to create a sense of of a theoretical boundary to what is and is not a crisis. There's another component to crisis management that's becoming more popular, and you'll see this later in the textbook as well, and that is the study of risk. Risk is looking at, kind of pre-crisis work, thinking ahead, what could happen, what could go wrong. And in Chapter 10, there's a better explanation of what risk management is. But in today's world, we're not only studying a crisis as it happens, we're studying what happens before the crisis and the assessment of risk, and we're going to be studying what happens after a crisis, in particular using your author's sense of a rhetoric of renewal. So our first thing to do when we see a news study or a news report, or we hear about something going wrong, ask yourself, is it truly a crisis? Does it fit our parameters? If not, that doesn't mean we ignore it, but it means we're probably not going to be able to write about it or talk about it in the same way. A lot of different types of crises. Some people have to spend a part of their career just trying to figure out all the things that can go wrong to an organization. It can be a long list. There are those crises that are intentional. Terrorism is one since 9/11, which is always on the top of everyone's list. On the other hand, you are less likely to experience a terrorism attack than many other types of crises. One of the things we learn about crisis communication is it's sort of a mixture of reality and fear. And people might fear something far more than it actually is a threat to their lives. But terrorism is one of those things. It is a high level fear, but probably a lower level risk, because most of us are not in a place where terrorism is relevant. Things like sabotage, violence, employee relationships, including employee violence, risk management, hostile takeovers, leadership failures. Plenty of times we've identified crises that have happened because people did not think. They did not think things through. They did not ask questions. They didn't take or do the due diligence necessary to anticipate issues that could be offensive to others or harmful. Those are intentional crises because people simply did not do the work necessary to mitigate and limit the chance of a crisis happening to themselves. Unintentional crises, natural disasters, disease, technical failures, product failures. There are a lot of things that go wrong. Accidents happen. Weather happens. They are saying because of climate change, we will have more bad weather. So we often think about those kind of crises that happen unintentionally. So there are a lot of things that qualify for a crisis from our textbook perspective. A couple other things to think about with this chapter. A crisis is now a global issue. Social media makes it possible for crises to happen around the world. They're difficult to hide. And so now, you can sit in Iowa and read about a crisis on the other part of the planet and be concerned about what that crisis is doing to a group of people. There are also a lot of misconceptions about crises, and on page 13 there's a good table that starts this discussion. I don't want to go through all the misconceptions one by one, but please pay attention to them. They will help you to understand why you need training in crisis communication and why people do not necessarily understand the scope of a crisis and its danger. This will wrap up Chapter 1. At the end of the lecture notes here, I have a few places to look. Think about where crisis communication occurs. If you're looking at a lot of natural disasters and issues, one of the best resources for you to learn from is ready.gov. The government has put together a site to help you prepare for and to answer questions about any kind of disaster, terrorism, natural disaster, weather-related issues, etc. Emergency CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is responsible for protecting us from plagues and outbreaks. They help follow, for example, the flu outbreaks in the United States. They've done a lot of great research on crisis communication. They're a good resource for you to look at. Ever since 9/11, our Homeland Security Department has been expanded and has brought together many government agencies. We also have a Homeland Security Agency for the state, and we also have emergency preparedness resources available from a county-to-county perspective, including Black Hawk County. So there are a lot of places you can look for ideas, maybe for a paper, or for you to start familiarizing yourself with how government and other agencies try to prepare the public for a crisis. So, we'll move on to Chapter 2. This first week gives you an introduction to what we mean by a crisis and some of the different kinds of things we study. And next week, we'll start looking at some examples and getting you to start talking about and thinking about the crises that you've experienced in your life. See you at Chapter 2.